So good afternoon, everybody. I see we have a nice audience building up. We had 100 plus participants registering, so I'm assuming some more people will join in the next couple of minutes, but I would not want to wait too long before kicking off. So first of all, a warm welcome to everybody in this webinar by the Community of Practice for Reusable Packaging, set up by KIDV, the Netherlands Institute for Sustainable Packaging. And today's webinar, which is I think the 10th or 11th, the last 2-3 years, is particularly focusing on reusable packaging in Germany and learnings we can take from there back to the Netherlands or any country you're dialing in from. We do have a short announcement program-wise. At least here in the Netherlands, we sometimes seem to forget COVID is still among us. However, not one but two of our speakers, unfortunately, in the last day or even last hours have been struck by COVID and are not able to attend, unfortunately. This is Martina Schilling of Friesland Campina. So obviously wishing her a speedy recovery, and the same for Sascha Riet from Bio Company. The good thing is, though, if we look at our next slides and the program, we have a lineup of very knowledgeable speakers on reusable packaging, which is Anika Opperman, who is co-organizing today's program, who is the chairwoman of the German Reuse Association, Mehrwegverband Deutschland, and an owner and co-founder of Shafuto, consulting and project management for reusable packaging. Tobias Bielenstein of Genossenschaft Deutsche Brunnen, pardon my German, and also from Arbeitskreis Mehrweg, who will also introduce himself a little bit later, and André Lang-Herfurth, founder of CME and operator of System Zero. Just a brief introduction. They will tell more about themselves later on. And for those that are still joining, welcome. This is the agenda, and as I briefly explained, it is slightly changed because of two unfortunate cases of COVID with two of our speakers, leading to this slightly modified agenda. Taking this brief introduction to also tell you a little bit, for those that haven't heard this for the 9th or 10th time, about us, the host of today's webinar. So we are the Knowledge Institute for Sustainable Packaging, abbreviated KIDV in Dutch. And we started a community of practice for reusable packaging in 2019, because we noticed the topic was increasing in interest, lots of questions, a lot of unclarity, very little information available. So we started bringing this information together, creating a network, connecting professionals, initially in the Netherlands, but more and more beyond in Europe and even outside Europe. I think we have some participants from outside Europe, so warm welcome. We generate and disseminate knowledge. Some of the knowledge is existing and brought by the different members of the platform, and others we generate ourselves by creating meetings and brainstorms. We do webinars like these where professionals will talk about their experiences. We initiate and facilitate pilots, and we develop tools such as the calculation tool for reusable packaging that you can find in the link here. So that in a nutshell is about the community of practice, and why we are hosting this series is really to bring knowledge together and speed up the implementation of reusable packaging. So without further ado, I want to highlight one of our next events, which might be interesting, at least for those of you based in the Netherlands. This is what we call KIDV a verdiepingsbijeenkomst. So this is a gathering, a physical gathering on one specific topic, which sometimes is on recycling or developments in chemical recycling, whatnot. This year, it would not surprise you, we are focusing on reusable packaging because a lot is happening not only in the Netherlands, but throughout Europe, I would say. So mark your dates, 28th of June, 2 o'clock in Hoofddorp. You can register by looking in our agenda, or potentially in the link that my colleagues might share in the chat. So this is a physical meeting in Dutch in the Netherlands, and so perhaps interesting for most of you, but not everyone here, I would imagine, speaks Dutch. So with that, I would like to kick off today's webinar by basically activating you, dear audience. So all 70 plus attendees, please have your fingers on the mouse. We would very briefly, after introducing ourselves, we would like to ask you to share with us who you are not necessarily your name, but in the poll we have two very short questions. First of all, what organization do you work for? And secondly, what role do you fill in this organization? And that would give us a bit of an understanding, who is our audience, what role do you fulfill? So starting with the organization you work for, could you please click on one of the answers and we will see the results appearing live in the screen. Packaging manufacturers taking the lead. Service providers doing quite well. We have 9 people, 10 people from service providers, which could be anything from providing a system of reusable packaging or a cleaning service, or perhaps the IT system behind deposit models and so forth. Packaging manufacturers, I would say, speaks for itself. We do have a number of researchers, welcome again, NGOs, a few people from the government, and some retailers and brand owners. I mean, all of you guys are linked to this system. Scrolling a little bit down, we will also see a lot of others, which I'm obviously curious what that would entail, but that could be, I guess, anything from academics or students to any other function, being logistics or something along these lines. So with having now a bit of an idea who is sitting with us at the virtual table, I would also like to understand the type of role you have within your organization. So if we would move dear March and Jorik to the next slide. Yes, thank you. What role do you fulfill in this organization? Quite a few R&D people on board. Great to see. Number of entrepreneurs, some students. Welcome, guys. Hope you learn a lot of stuff from today. Packaging designers such as myself, always good to see. Marketing and sales. Very little finance people. Perhaps not surprising, because the topic on one hand seems first and most of all an organizational or an R&D/supply chain type of thing, but you'd be surprised how much of reuse models are linked to finance. So having now a clearer understanding of who we have on board, I would like to move on basically and indeed introduce our first speaker of today. Welcome, Anika. I will not repeat what organizations you represent, because I think you're more than capable to do that yourself. So I will shut up, close my camera, and leave the floor to you, but not before mentioning to our dear participants that you can always ask questions in the chat. We will keep an eye on that. And if there's always availability at the end of the presentations for a few questions, and otherwise we will save them and move them to the panel discussion. So fear not, ask your questions. There are no stupid questions. If there's any term that you don't understand, please let us know and we'll try and answer you. With that, the microphone and the floor is yours, Anika.
Thank you very much, Marcel, for this kind introduction. And I'm super excited to also welcome all of you, almost 80 participants, to our today's webinar, which KIDV and our German Association for Reusable Packaging are co-organizing. I will give a brief introduction and overview of what is actually happening in Germany. Where are we coming from? Where is it going? And what is needed in order to scale reusable packaging nationwide and also actually European-wide. But first of all, let us look into our introduction or our definition of reusable packaging, because what in Germany, in our Packaging Act, we've got actually a very clear definition of reusable packaging. And reusable packaging in Germany is really characterized by a packaging that is being reused multiple times for the same purpose, that has sufficient logistics allowing return and reuse. So, for example, a reverse vending machine or some other infrastructure that allows to give back returnable, reusable packaging, and also the logistics in the background in order to bring it back to the producer or whoever reuses the packaging, where it's being cleaned and then refilled or reused. It's also important as part of the definition that reusable packaging is connected to a proper or a suitable incentive system. For example, a deposit, but it could be also a different type of incentive system to actually encourage returns. And we've got a speaker today, Tobias Bielenstein, who's also the COO of the working group Refillables, Arbeitskreis Mehrweg, as Marcel already introduced. They have actually started with a logo at 2003, and I will not talk too much about it since Tobias will introduce this label in a few minutes in his presentation. What I want to show here is that in comparison to single-use bottles which have a deposit, there is an obligation to have a logo on those bottles. For reusable packaging, there is no obligatory logo or label that has to be put on reusable packaging items, but we do have those two voluntary labels that are possible to include and put on your packaging, on reusable packaging, to identify and make it easier for consumers to see which packaging is actually reusable. When we look into where reusable packaging in Germany actually comes from, basically reusable packaging has always been there. I will not go through the details of this approximate timeline. Reusable packaging has been introduced already more than 200 years ago in the beer sector. When you look at the timeline, it has always been focusing very much on the beverage sector, both on soft drinks, waters, beers, even juices, and also there was some wine in between. In the late 70s, there has been an experiment, or not an experiment, but a project to implement reusable packaging also in the organic sector for foods. But that has unfortunately failed back then, which might be interesting to look into why, or what are actually success factors. I will mention that later. And also in the late 70s, reusable transport crates have been implemented and become a very important element, or very important application area for reusable packaging as well in Germany, but also abroad. And in the last few years, actually, what we do see, and I will pick that up in a few minutes, is that while in the past it has been focusing very much on the beverage sector, in the last 5 years, a lot of pioneers have been exploring reusable packaging in other categories, such as to-go or takeaway food, in the prepackaged food, in the prepackaged personal care area, and also in the e-commerce area. And before I will look into those developments of the last 5 years, let's have a look of what actually is the current status quo of reusable packaging in Germany. And our environmental agency, our federal environmental agency, is annually collecting data on what is actually the reusable packaging share in different categories, such as beer, water, soft drinks, and other alcoholic mixed beverages, which, as I've just shown, are the typical ones where reusable packaging has been there for decades. And what we do see is that it varies tremendously depending on the categories. And beer being almost at 80% market share, or products being sold in reusable packaging, whereas in soft drinks it's barely at 22%. And overall, we've got an average of around 42%. That was the numbers in 2019. And when we look into our history of reusable packaging, we actually see, when we look on the right side on this graph, 20, 30 years back, our overall share of reusable packaging has been much higher. It has been always around 70, even 74% almost. But at the end of the 90s, this share has been dropping tremendously, or relatively tremendously, from around 74% to around 66%. And back then, the discussion started, okay, how can we actually maintain and increase again the share of reusable packaging? Because they did not, well, the reusable packaging share was decreasing too much. And what legislation back then did is to introduce, or they thought that one great thing to do is to implement deposits on single-use packaging, because that might stimulate reusable packaging. That was their thought back then. So in 2003, actually, our deposit return scheme for single-use beverage packaging has been introduced, again, with the idea to stimulate reusable packaging. So when we look into if that actually had an effect, as one of the first learnings from Germany, if the deposit return scheme for single-use packaging had an effect, actually on the short term, it actually did have an effect. So when you look here into this timeline from 2003, 2002, 2003 to 2006, it actually increased for a moment the share of reusable packaging. So it did have a short-term effect, but actually afterwards the decrease was maybe even steeper, leveling off at around the 42% that I mentioned a few minutes earlier. So one of the learnings that we have in Germany is that those single-use deposit schemes were only temporarily successful in establishing or maintaining the share of reusable packaging quotas, and might not be the most effective way to increase the share of reusable packaging. So if we stick to the politics and legislation, basically what happened for a long time, actually not much has actually happened, and only in 2019 when the packaging directive became actually a packaging act, a packaging law in Germany, then the reusable packaging quota of 70%, or the reusable packaging target of 70%, had been introduced to the beverage sector, to the categories as just mentioned. And again, then not much has happened since then. So there was a little bit of formalities, so that, for example, from this year onward, reusable packaging must be registered at our national packaging register. And also from this year onward, in our environmental statistics law, or Environmental Statistics Act, the number of reusable packaging in the market, both from brand owners but also from reusable packaging systems, have to be reported. So in order to monitor how much actually is in circulation and how effective those reuse systems actually are. There is, of course, coming from the European perspective about the Single-Use Plastics Directive, also implementation of this directive on a national level in Germany. One of them being that from next year onwards, from January onwards, there is an obligation to offer reusable packaging alternatives in the, let's say, layman terms, in the takeaway to go sector. So that could affect both retailers who have got a salad bar. It definitely affects restaurants and other canteens and catering services that do offer food and drinks for takeaway. And with a few gray zones here and there, but in principle there was this obligation. Again, like with the quota from 2019, also here, it is unfortunately not bound to specific reduction targets. So there was this obligation to offer reusable packaging, but it doesn't say by how much the single-use packaging aims to be reduced. Also, for looking at the legislation from 2019, it was not very clear, or it is still actually not very clear in that case, who is responsible for implementing the 70% target, and what happens if you don't do it. So our legislation, to wrap this up, is a little bit more following what is happening in Germany on the market, but not necessarily driving or front-running reusable packaging to push that forward. What we do see, since this target of 70% is still not reached, is that there are projects going on from our Ministry of Environment to see what kind of additional measures can be done, because including that quota or target in the Packaging Act did actually not change anything in our reusable packaging share in Germany in the beverage sector. So they're looking at the moment into what kind of additional measures can be implemented to actually increase the 42% back to the 70%. It is still not fulfilled. Additionally, there was also some research projects going on, financed or under the head of the Federal Environment Agency and some project partners, to see how can we actually or what potential is there for reusable packaging in other sectors, like what I mentioned earlier in the to-go sector, e-commerce sector, food and personal care, to see maybe as a basis for long-term reusable packaging strategy to look into. So this is currently under investigation to see what other potentials there can be. So that brings me to the question of what is actually happening in Germany on the market. If legislation is more following what's happening on the market, let us have a look into what is actually happening. And one of the first mentioned areas that I already mentioned is that in the to-go sector, we have seen since 2013 with Tiffin Loop as one of the very earliest pilots in the sector going on, and really a number of pioneering startups and companies who are offering reusable packaging for drinks, hot drinks in particular, nationwide, and then almost at the same time, all of those other companies have been coming into the market, offering really solutions for different application areas, such as more focusing on retail, focusing on gastronomy, focusing on the B2B sector when it comes to supplying also gastronomy and others with reusable packaging, and offering different business models and different services. So we could spend an hour probably only talking about reusable packaging in the to-go sector, because all of them are kind of addressing this target of gastronomy, retail, etc., everything that is for to go. But all of them differ more or less in their business model, in their formats, in the material, what they're using. So we've got a huge dynamics, again, pushed even more through legislation now. But most of them started before actually legislation was in place. Then another area which I already mentioned is this topic of prepackaged foods. And what we do see there is that we've got a couple of reusable packaging systems, such as what we call MMP, and Tobias will talk a little bit more about it, so I will not go too much into the detail here, but we've got reusable packaging that has been used traditionally for dairy products. And in the last 2-3 years, a lot of startups and also small and medium-sized companies have discovered that this is a great way to start with reusable packaging, because there were no such systems that they could join. So that was one of the only ones, or very few ones, where producers from other categories could quite easily join with their own initiative, with their own drive to actually implement reusable packaging, causing also quite some challenges along the way. So that is why Tobias will talk a little bit more about this system in particular, and what it means actually to manage, or why there was a need to transition from an unmanaged pool system, as this has been in the past, to a more managed pool system. And so this is one of the very, very dynamic environments which we see in Germany, really having product categories both from pickles, jams, ketchup, basically, a lot of dry products as well, now found in reusable packaging in those glass jars or glass bottles. So at the same time, for some brands, the packaging might not fit, the material might not be suitable for the product, or the format might not be the right one in terms of volume, or might it even be that brand owners more and more are looking also for some services included or connected to reusable packaging. That's why also at the same time, in the last 2-3 years in particular, many startups have been making their way and pioneering reusable packaging also in different ways, also in the prepackaged areas. So both in terms of foods, but also in terms of, for example, personal care. And this is just a couple of examples of reusable packaging system operators that are actually offering reusable packaging, being it stainless steel, glass, or different types of plastic for different application areas. So we see, in addition to MMP, wide range of new solutions coming up, and not only in terms of formats and volumes, for example, but also in terms of the business model as such. So basically, all of them are offering nowadays reusable packaging as a service. Basically, not only providing the packaging, but also providing services around like the logistics and cleaning to really make it as easy as possible for brand owners and retailers to switch to reusable packaging. In some cases, and André will also talk a little bit more about that from CIMI afterwards, is that in some cases they've really shown with their own product brand as a proof of concept that actually a system as theirs work as a proof of concept, and are now opening up to other brands and yeah, to make it easier for other brands to actually say, hey, look, this is working. There was a use case, consumers accept it, and therefore let's build this and let's build and scale this together. Also, what is the learning from Germany in this particular aspect here is that basically all systems are looking into where can we build on existing infrastructure, because that is also, in my opinion, in our opinion, key in order to really scale reusable packaging, that we can build on existing infrastructure, being it that that the packaging is compatible with, for example, those reusable transport B2B transport crates, or that it is compatible or compatible with the reverse vending machines, so that it can be as easy as possible for the consumer, for example, to return the packaging, or for example. Yeah, I think I've already mentioned these two examples. So really building on existing infrastructure, making it as easy as possible both for users but also for end consumers to implement reusable packaging. What we also see, apart from prepackaged FMCG products and the takeaway sector, is that also in e-commerce we've got quite a number of pioneering companies developing new solutions in the area of e-commerce. So one about the transport and shipping containers, can be both bags, boxes, pouches, different formats that are specially used and designed for e-commerce purposes, of especially non-food items. But not only that, we also have a couple of or quite some pioneering companies looking more into the alternatives to gorillas, etc., to really offering online groceries in reusable packaging. So to really make it easy for all those consumers that are now shifting more towards e-commerce and online groceries, to also be able to buy their products in reusable packaging. And what we do see is that these number of different solutions coming up in all the different areas in order to really and to really make the scale. I will switch to my second last slide because I think Marcel, you're showing up to say that I should wrap up. So really, as a key factor or key factors to really make reusable packaging easy, scalable, and competitive, we really need, as I already mentioned, new business models such as packaging as a service to really make it as easy as possible for food producers, brand owners to implement reusable packaging. We really should build on existing routines to make it as easy as possible for consumers to implement reusable packaging. We have to diversify our return options, because with all those increasing numbers of reusable packaging being in circulation, the current infrastructure is a good start, but definitely not sufficient in order to scale. And what is really needed also is in digital infrastructure, because the more we create such an ecosystem for reusable packaging, the more there is a need for actually also connecting all those different elements and different actors digitally. And apart from this, building on infrastructure, extending the infrastructure, standardization is key. Standardization and also digitalization to see where can we improve reusable packaging, at which elements can it be improved. And of course, we also need the right political legislation and framework in order to push reusable packaging and create a level playing field to implement implement reusable packaging and make it competitive to single-use packaging. So with that, I would like to finish my presentation and coming back to the beginning of where we actually, what we're doing as a Reuse Association or German Association for Reusable Packaging, that all those topics cannot be done alone. And this is why we have founded our German Association earlier this year, just a couple of months ago, bringing together all those different actors along the supply chain or along the circle to really work together on topics like the infrastructure, on topics like sanitization, sustainability assessment, and other topics in order to really bring reusable packaging forward. And also actually implementing or finishing or starting with the project on a European level together with Marcel and some other players on establishing such a European platform to bring also people together on a European platform. So thank you very much. That was my brief presentation, actually quite long, and I'm happy to hand over back to Marcel.
Switched off. Marcel, I think your microphone is still switched off. Maybe you can try to switch it on and off again.
You still can't hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah,
Right. So all the amount of gratitude and compliments that I gave to Anika, you did not hear, guys, but what I basically said is, it's such a massive amount of information and a wealth of knowledge and experience that you have, the German Reuse Association, and you personally, that we would, be able to hear lots more from you. At the same time, we need to condense the information into 1.5 hours. The good thing is we have now almost 100 people on board. And for those that didn't hear my short introduction and apology up front, we have a slight change of program since 2 of the speakers, unfortunately, were struck the last 24 hours with COVID. It is still amongst us. And fortunately, we have a wealth of experience in the current speakers. So I still hope you stay with us and enjoy the lineup, which is a cue for Tobias to switch on his microphone and camera. Our next speaker, who will introduce himself, when mentioning the words authority on reusable packaging, I could not think of another person in Germany almost more suitable than you. So setting the bar and raising expectations, I hand the microphone over to you, Tobias.
Well, thank you very much. That puts quite some pressure on me. So, yeah, but okay, the easy part for me is I can relate to very much of what Anika said. So the stage is set already, and I can go back to some of the points Anika already mentioned. And the first thing she mentioned was the refillable working group. So if you Google me, you find 2 functions with me. One is at GDB, and I'll come back to that in just a few slides. And the other position is that I'm COO of the refillable working group. And both organizations have a direct tie because actually the refillable working group was co-founded by GDB. And what we do here is at the working group is we are running this logo. And if you remember back what Anika said, she said that in 2003 we had the compulsory deposit for single-use packaging in beverages coming onto the market. And actually this was the reason to come up with this logo, because until then, deposit was a clear marker, a distinguishing marker for reuse. And in the moment where we had a compulsory deposit on single-use packaging, suddenly the distinguishing marker disappeared. And so we had to do something in terms of communication. That is actually the reason why we have this sign here. And the second thing we do is we are working kind of a think tank and at information points. So many companies ask us questions, but also authorities, scientists, and so on. And as you see, there is also other versions of this logo in other languages, also, by the way, in Dutch. And if you have some feedback on that to me, I would be very happy. I know there's actually one company applying it in the Netherlands. So this is the Reusable logo. And there are about 220 companies out there using this for, actually I have to update this. It's probably now more than 660, 670 brands. Now the second thing, and by the way, I will briefly talk about a few things regarding reuse in general and definitions, and then I come to MMP and the GDB system. And actually, Anika already mentioned the German definition of reuse, and what I would like to put your attention to is in the European Union, on the European level, we have a different definition of reuse, which is, in my view, weaker, because it only mentioned that it's a packaging basically to be reused, and there are no other accompanying features. And I think in this respect, the German law is stronger. And actually, we are applying the German law when we check companies whether they should have the right to use the refillable logo. So we check also for incentive to return the packaging, which is not in the European law. There is a second, weaker aspect, which is actually, is there an intended transfer of ownership? There are two sides on that, and we can talk about this maybe later on, because there's a legal situation, and then there is the intended transfer of ownership, which is definitely not the case if you're doing reusable. You want to have your packaging back. And of course, it's the governance system. And this is maybe one of the most important things. A good governance for the system. And I'm saying this because we have currently a very interesting discussion on the European level. And this is, and some of you might know this definition, which comes from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where they're coming up with a very different understanding of what's reuse. And if this comes, or if this is going to be part of the European legislation, and there are discussions right now, because as you might know, there's a revision of the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive. We are really concerned if also refill at home and refill on the go in the definition of Ellen MacArthur would become part of reuse. Because we make a clear distinction between something that is a refillable or reusable packaging and something that is an item for personal use and which is basically owned by yourself. This is definitely part of waste prevention, but it's not packaging. This is, in our view, a very, very important point, and it will be a point of discussion in the upcoming month. Because if we would have such a broad definition of reuse, we are running into deep trouble, because in the long run, we wouldn't be able to address, like we have in Germany, quotas for reuse, but we would also not be able to address any other kind of legislation under such a definition. So this is a very important point. If we think about what's reuse and what's not reuse, packaging. And then I want to take you one step further to make it even a little bit more complicated, which is this slide here. And I always say, once you have understood this slide, you really have understood almost everything what that has to be known about reuse. So basically, it's a kind of an algorithm if you go through this and to understand what kind of packaging do I have. And I might take this bottle here and I see, okay, what is it? It's a glass bottle. And it could be also a PET bottle or it could be a can. So that's always the first question, and it's associated to typical issues like if it's beer, it would be almost unsaleable in Germany, at least, if it would be a PET bottle. For mineral water, it's okay. Next question is it reuse or is it single use? Is it a refillable? And this bottle here, it is refillable. But then the next question is, hey, who's actually running this system? Is it an individual bottle, so a bottle that's owned by only one company? Or, as we do here in Germany in many cases, is it a so-called pool bottle? Not a full bottle, sorry. And the pool bottles basically means there are many companies sharing the same packaging, which is definitely a challenge because you are cooperating with your competitors. And that's so important that if you are running a pool system, you have to have a kind of governance and management system behind it. And so this is the ways how to distinguish or reuse packaging. And we have both on the market. We have actually individual reuse bottles or reuse packaging. We have pool packaging on the market. And we have both also managed and unmanaged system. But this is definitely an easy to do prediction. I think in the long run, and the long run means in the next 5 years, we are not having any unmanaged systems anymore, at least not in Germany, because the issues associated to that are quite a few. And if you want to dig deeper into this, actually, we, together with some organizations, we just published a paper on that, which is called The Need to Set Essential Criteria for Setting Up Managed Pool Systems. And you will find it in this link here on the Zero Waste Europe website. Next step. How is actually reuse organized? And actually, it's a simple thing. We distribute the packaging, the consumer buy, they return it, and then it's running back to the producer. I'm only showing this here for two reasons. Number one is, please always think of the double circle of reuse. A reuse packaging, and I can tell you that's, in my view, true for all kind of packaging, reusable packaging I know, will be fully recycled after it has to be ejected because it's too old or it's broken or whatever. So that's very important. So it's not only zero waste by default because it's a reusable packaging, it's also reusable or zero waste by default because it's in the second loop where it will be recycled. Second thing why I'm showing this here is I only learned this morning when we had a brief call of how to handle this situation with our two colleagues who have COVID, that the system in the Netherlands works different than that from Germany. So in Germany, if you're a producer and you're delivering to your retail partner, the packaging is already associated with a deposit. And to my understanding, what I learned this morning is in Germany, in the Netherlands, you will have the deposit only being applied on the B2C level. So at the retailer selling the packaging to the consumer, but on the B2B level, you are not applying a deposit, and that's maybe an important and very interesting detail. I would like to learn on that, more on that. Next slide is now what Anika already mentioned, the MMP pool. And this is really an amazing and very interesting development because actually MMP, it's now for Mach Mehrweg, which means do reuse, but initially it was for Milch Mehrweg pool, so the milk reuse pool. And actually it's out there since the 80s of the last centuries. And we have 4 containers here, 1 liter and half liter bottles, 250 grams and 500 gram jars in 2 colors, brown and white. This system was, well, used since the 90s, and there was a sharp decline in the usage of these containers because we had more of single-use packaging coming up. And actually, the companies, and one of the most important users is actually a Dutch-German company, Friesland Campina, the biggest user of this packaging. They somehow still kept it, but it was, if you look back 4 years, just there. And then suddenly some creative companies came up and said, hey, we can use this packaging, this reuse packaging for other stuff, like tea, rice, nuts, and whatever. And suddenly in 2019, in my view, is the changing year. I call it the Greta year. It's the single-use packaging directive year. So it's a year, maybe in a few years, we will look back to 2019 and say, this was really the year where everything changed. It was actually the year where we observed suddenly a growth in this sector. Because I can tell you from about, one call per week in our hotline at the Reuse Working Group, we suddenly had 1 call per day. And actually nowadays it's even more. With small companies just asking, how can we enter this system here? And actually at that point, the management of this pool was kind of, let's say, sleepy. It was not really in existence anymore. And with these new companies, and the numbers here are really amazing. It was like 20 companies or 25 companies in 2018, 17, 19. And today we have more than 150 companies with more than 1,000 products. So it's an enormous success story, but also enormous growth story here. And the consequence here, of course, is as it is a pool system, we had to reintroduce the pool management, which is actually currently happening. So it's an amazing story. It's an example, and this is why we consider it really important, how you can set up easy and fast growing. This system is scalable at a very high speed. And if you ask for the reason why, it's very simple. It's using an established infrastructure, which is these glasses can be returned in the same reverse vending machines like you return your beverage containers. So what I'm basically saying is this would also work from one day to another in the Netherlands, because to my knowledge, in every Albert Heijn supermarket or Jumbo supermarket, you have a reverse vending machine. So it's very easy. And this is the second part of this success story, very easy accessible for small and medium companies. So it's not true what many people tell us. The hurdles to enter a reuse system are so high that small companies can't enter it. I would say from this experience, it's exactly the other way around. It's very easy for a startup or a small company to enter this system, but and that's also a learning here. We can't run such a system if we have more than 100 companies, if we have more than 1,000 products without a proper management system. And that's what's currently happening. And so this was a view to a kind of startup situation. And if we look at a more mature system, and these are the final 2-3 minutes, I'm going to talk about GDB system. So GDB basically is a cooperative. So basically our customers are also our owners. That's why I always coin it a little bit like we are a non-profit. But basically we are a company, but in ownership of the customers. It's out there since 85 years. So we have quite some experience. And actually we are not only running the pool systems here, we are also a trading company offering to mineral water and alcohol, so carbonated soft drink producers, everything they need for their production. But if people know us, and actually we are proud of being an invisible small champion, because probably it's the biggest managed reuse system in Europe we are operating here, but nobody knows that. So we always say, It's not us, it's the brands using the packaging here. And if you look at the numbers in the mineral water market and the mineral water-based carbons soft drinks, our market share is 41%. This 41% covers the reuse part and the single-use part. So we are quite have a market share here with some 6 billion bottles filled per year. And we have a glass reuse system, we have a PET reuse system, and we have some smaller parts where we, for example, have a system that's based on reusable crates with single-use bottles. Now, part of this system here is that it's very decentralized. If you look at the dots here on the map, you see these are all the places where our bottles are filled. Now, this is one more value of such a pool system. If a bottle is filled in the south, it can be returned in the north, and there is no need to transport the bottle back to the south. It can be used by a company in the north, so it's also in this respect very efficient. Actually, with this design of the bottle, 97% of German consumers know the bottle, so it's also a brand. And one more important point, we are constantly advancing our pool system. So the newest bottle type was just introduced 4 years ago. A final word on standardizing. Anika already said standardizing is very important in order to reduce complexity. But on the other hand, we know there are certain needs to meet consumers' expectations. And our message here is pool bottles does not mean uniformity. We can have a broad variety of containers within standards. And you see here, it's specialized bottles for soft drinks, it's for mineral water, and this is only the mineral and soft drink sector. We have even more bottles for beer, for juice, and so on. Final slide. This is also something that's actually very important to me. We are not just good by doing reuse. We have further challenges, and if we look around, I always tend to say I'm not interested in reuse, which is basically true because I'm interested in saving the climate and saving our planet. And if we do reuse the right way, we are on the path to saving the climate. But think about glass bottles, think about the labels, think about the caps and so on. We have to work also on these things to be fully recyclable. And so our bottles are fully recyclable, our crates are fully recyclable. We are still working on the caps, and we have actually both for paper and for plastic labels, the first examples to fully recycle them 100%. What we are still working on, I told you, we have closed loops for bottles and we have closed loops for crates. We are working on the closed loops for caps and labels. Next step. And this is the biggest project I'm currently running, is getting the production of all bottles, glass and PET and crates and caps carbon neutral by 2030. And this is a huge project because we have to cooperate with all our suppliers here, and also they need to comply with what we have to do in order to save our planet. And the good news is, so far, it's a really good project. We have already taken, after 1.5 years, some major steps, but there's a long way to go. Now we'll be there by 2030. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tobias, just checking if my microphone works this time.
Yep.
Yeah, you can hear me. Excellent. Well, as I kind of predicted, this is a wealth of information and experience that half of which I would imagine we are way too early to understand almost even what you're saying and the learnings you're sharing. So I think, the report, the link to which you shared, and that will also highlight in the mailing of this webinar afterwards, I think makes a lot of sense. So we can, let it sink in and understand what you're saying and the lessons you're bringing. We do have 2 questions in the chat, but for time's sake, I would suggest that either, perhaps you can answer some of it in the chat, but we do have a panel discussion at the end. But before we are there, I would first of all like to thank you very much, Tobias, and I will see you in a little while in the panel discussion. And with this, I'm also calling for André to switch on his microphone and camera. And I see your presentation. And
Hello.
I think we hear you. Yes, we hear you. We can't not see you just yet, but at least we hear you. And there is the camera. Excellent.
Awesome.
So,
Now I do have a question. We are at 5 to 4. Do I really have these 15 minutes, or due to the panel discussion, we should maybe switch to the shorter version that I initially prepared?
Yeah, I would suggest to take max 10 minutes, and then we move some of those questions anyway to the panel discussion. So that that would be
Jorik, would you please switch back to the original presentation then, because I think we're going to be in better time, and I'm starting to speak without a presentation. So if you just click on me quickly, you grant Jorik a few minutes to switch the presentation, and I start explaining to you what we're doing at the CIMI GmbH.
and I will switch
at
my
CIMI. We are a startup with a lot of what you just heard from Tobias. We took the bottle that we know from the beverage industry, and we said, why does this only exist for beverages when there are other type of propositions like hand lotion or soap or Entspannungsbad, like a bath soap, could also be in bottles. And we developed a bottle that is essentially identical. Oh, and I can switch this way. Perfect. Okay, got it. And we essentially designed a bottle with a glass manufacturer in Germany that is suitable for deposit machines and does the exact same thing as a managed pool for beverages. So what we started doing is we started building our own brand to establish a nationwide dealer and collection network, because when we first started saying, hey, why don't we do a closed loop deposit-based reuse system to our targeted retailers, they said, this doesn't exist, can't be done, no need. So we said, okay, we build our own brand and prove it's possible. And as such, we are pioneering infrastructure, delivering proof of market, and are piloting new categories and moving forward containers with our own brand. You can see, okay, I'm switching. So if you stay with the screen, then this is how we're going to cut it short. Nice. So as you can see here, a couple of pictures of the type of products that we're selling, the type of approach to the point of sale, where we are showing in essentially as a new category, this all can be done in a reused approach, and we're having fun marketing this brand. We have, with it, we are essentially selling the product conventionally, but we are adding 50-cent deposit. And as Tobias just shared, we are utilizing the existing infrastructure of empties of deposit return machines to collect our empty containers. And by doing this with our own brand CIMI, after 1 year, we are now covering 900 stores in Germany and Austria for deposit return places. And I'm saying it this way because we're currently selling at 350, and the difference are retailers that are up for collecting bottles to be available as a return point. This is a very intriguing, interesting element, because it actually enables us to start e-commerce and direct sales, and at the same time be able to start collecting bottles via these retailers who are in a position to receive very interesting foot traffic, because it's a very sustainable minded target group that we are serving. So as just shared, and a lot of the things come back what Tobias shared with us just now, while doing this with our own brand, we are essentially building a value chain that can become zero waste across the entire value chain for an entire industry. So as known from beverages, empty bottles are filled with all types of different recipes, Rezeptur, recipes. Sounds weird, but recipes. So soaps, lotions, shampoo, you have it. And this happens in the first cycle. We like to think in 3 cycles, actually. The first is the brand cycle, where the product comes from. Via trade and retail partners, it's being sold, filled up, it's being used up, and returned at our 900 drop-off points as of today. Of course, we're working on increasing those moving forward. And trade collects these bottles, and we look to collect those bottles in as much volume as possible for environmental purposes and cost purposes, and return them to our washing infrastructure, which of course we're building slowly because we're a startup that's in the market now for a little over a year. So we're not yet nationwide when it comes to cleaning. It's a big effort moving forward, and this is also where the Reuse Association comes into place, which we are part of, that Anika introduced earlier, because here we're working with other companies building infrastructure for reuse systems to identify where there are synergies moving forward. And once bottles are cleaned, they're ready for refill. And since we're doing this with CME for our own brand, and we're learning with trade and with the entire value chain how to do this, we are in a position to build on top of this essentially a pool system that we open up and want to offer to the entire industry. So for all kinds of brands, and we're calling it Zero with 3 O's. So in the shadow of CME, we actually just launched Zero, the reusable packaging system for personal care. And we have a variety of containers. You can see in the picture our default 250 milliliter bottle with different color executions, different types of lids. And we are preparing to launch a 50 milliliter jar, which is going to take very similar to everything you just heard. Now, these are collected the same way as CME bottles are collected today. And they're all recognizable via these 3 O's, being the route towards a zero waste future. And we are going to pool this and scale this with brands that are entering the system. We have 10 NDAs signed. We've got an exciting startup that I can share with you. So next to soap, we're talking about toothbrush, which will come in our brown colored version of the bottle, which is standardized from the form factor size and from how it's being accepted at the deposit return machines. But from a color perspective, we are offering some variety when it comes to need for protection as well as branding differences. And this is a startup that does toothpaste, John Lee and Moon. So they're aiming to come into the system at the end of the year. But before that, in summer, we're going to see some luxury brands and household staple brands that are going to enter the system this summer with their first categories coming in. And that's what we do at CME GmbH, building in the shadow of a consumer brand an entire pool system as inspiration and a route that fits into everything you just heard, and which may be of inspiration, I hope so. Or maybe for cooperation, because the Netherlands, of course, are on the map as well eventually. But we do need to start somewhere. That's it from our side. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you so much, André. That was excellent work. We do apologize with the nature of having 2 speakers cancelled. We were convinced we would be able to give you a little bit more time, but the topics being highly interesting, and we don't manage to answer all the questions in the chat. However, we will come to them in the panel discussion, and I'm actually quite excited to see the preview that you gave on some of the developments you guys are working on. Because I'm basically, I guess, looking at 2 different companies almost, right? There's CME as a brand using reusables, and there's Zero that is facilitating this. And I guess this is exactly what we would need also in the Netherlands with other countries moving to reusables. We would need companies offering exactly that. So, again, it's not for nothing that we branded this webinar Reuse Lessons from Germany. I think you guys are ahead of where we are, and I would imagine your brand, but also your other company, Zero, potentially would offer something that we can indeed learn from. So just quickly checking if there's a question that's particularly for your offer, and There is a question from Iris and Lucy. Do small containers actually fit into the reverse vending machines? Because I was wondering the same with the little pumping system. Doesn't it hook
Yes.
on? Or?
Those are two good questions. Our 250 milliliter bottles with all types of lids that we have are compatible with all deposit return vending machines. We're working on even eliminating those and asking users to keep them at home. And those are completely compatible, but you're right, those are the nags that you need to pay attention to when developing this, that the pump is not wider. For
Right.
the jars, no, as of right now, they're not confirmed to fit with the deposit return vending machines. We are collecting our empties at the deposit return vending machines, but we're also collecting them at cashiers. And the types of propositions that we are starting to launch are actually going to go primarily into what they call drugstores in Germany, like Butni Müller. I can't think of the Netherlands having something complete. HEMA, maybe the HEMA you would consider something like that. And the type of propositions that are sold there, it's all collected at the cash register. So no, the first 50 milliliters will not be collected via the reverse vending machines. The bottles will, yes. The propositions aimed for 50 milliliter type of propositions in Germany are going to be focused on drugstores. So we don't anticipate issues because of that. But it's a very good question. And it shows that collecting bottles, of course, once you move into massive volumes, you will need machines. The way we are starting, we are essentially establishing a route of collecting via cashiers where there are no return vending machines and where there are a lot of propositions that are sold in this type of container. Not everything is perfect right from the start, but we need to start somewhere.
That's certainly true. I would tell from the experience I've been having in talking to many different people in many different countries. If you don't have a returnable system at all, at least in the Netherlands, we do, the beer bottles and the single-use PET bottles. It's a beginning. We have the reverse vending machines. We know the system of statiegeld, right? Deposits. But many countries don't even have that. So their beginning exactly should be something along these lines. You need to start somewhere. And I would imagine any retailers might not necessarily get very excited by their cashiers collecting empty bottles and jars. At the same time, I know in the Netherlands, for example, organic stores, they have quite a few more jars than the big retailers. So, there is possibilities, but I would agree when you move to big volumes, you would have different discussions with those retailers.
That will come, but once we come there, we have achieved a lot.
Yeah. So quick question from William in the chat, and then I would like to move move to the panel discussion. Ramon is asking if your focus from CME and Zero perhaps is only on glass containers.
No, moving forward, we will look at alternative materials to cover additional categories. We're working with Technical University Hamburg to develop next containers for next year. We are not anti-plastic, we are anti-single-use, and we see multiple routes that go there. And plastic, a type of plastic is a valid route as long as we eliminate just using it once. That's our position.
I almost said hallelujah, but I will not. I would certainly agree. And whilst our next panel speakers open up their cameras, I will like to ask the audience for a quick input from their side, which is particularly around the topic of a deposit and the height of a deposit. So, statiegeld, as I mentioned in Dutch, what would you as an audience or as a consumer actually, not as a professional, think is a reasonable amount for a deposit on these three different types of containers? Now you can have a quick look at them, and then in three separate poll questions, we would like to tick the box that you think is a proper amount, and that you would also, as a person, be willing to pay. So we start with the 1 liter mineral bottle, then your CME jar, André, and then a polypropylene, I think, container for reuse and takeout, etc. So Jorik, if you can, or Marge, kick in the first poll question. Please, audience, let us know your thought on a reasonable deposit for a 1 liter mineral water bottle in glass. We do see something of a consensus in the middle, I would say, where the majority seems to center around 25 or 50 cents. slight upper hand for the 50 cent, which is a good sign, meaning we are also willing to pay a little bit more. For the dear participants, we pay 10 cents for most beer bottles in the Netherlands. And I think it's 25 cents for a 1 liter PET bottle, for example. So moving to the CME bottle, what would you, dear participants, be willing to pay for this? Bearing in mind it's a startup, bearing in mind it's a more sophisticated packaging, bearing in mind the great presentation André just gave. We see a bit of a consensus around the 50 cents to €1. And I think those participants that paid attention, somewhere up the very first slide you did, André, I think you mentioned the amount that you guys charge, right? Which is 50 cents, if I recall correctly.
Yes, it's 50 cents right now, but it's exactly the two values that we've been going back and forth with. What is the appropriate value?
Well, good to see that this seems to be the figure most people are willing to do. And then for a reusable meal container, that's you can see already that the heights of the deposit move already away from the 5 and 10 cents, more into the multiple euro figures. And this will be interesting for the takeaway sector, where Germany is actually launching this legislation ahead of the Netherlands. We're following you guys with about a year later, where takeout and to-go meals in a container also need to have a reusable option. And 1 to 2.5 euros seems to be the most answers. So people are a little bit on the lower scale. A few people say, well, 5 euros is fine as long as I get it back. So with this, I would like to kick off the panel discussion, and building on this, just wondering, I think you already highlighted a little bit, André, that indeed for your packaging, 50 cents, perhaps €1 seemed feasible. And I'm guessing, and this is basically a question to all of you, is this based on the willingness of consumers to pay that amount, or also the actual cost of the container that you want to cover? André. Yeah, I think all of us, we can open the microphone.
Yes, okay, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Whether the 50 cents that you guys charge for the CME container, is that pretty much based on the willingness of consumers to pay for this amount? Because a high amount would become a hurdle or something, or is it perhaps also taking into consideration the actual cost of the packaging?
No, in our case, it's, well, both, but really there's one more element, and that is to what extent a retailer is willing to come along when we start. So obviously when we start, we talk to buyers, and they also have views and believe in something or not. So all three factors led to us going for 50 cents. It's a matter of, does retail want to carry the message with us, or do they think it's too expensive or not? It is the willingness of consumers. And yes, we had exactly this discussion, 50 cent, €1, somewhere in between. And then it's also, of course, the initial cost. Specifically for a startup, we initially have to pre-finance a lot of the containers, and moving forward and scaling cleaning infrastructure, we actually anticipate a significant reduction in cost, rather than always buying new bottles, considering also resource prices developing under the current circumstances. But that's not given at first. So we did need to consider how much is the container at the very beginning, and how do we work with that. Since we aim to be a pool provider with zero, in the beverage industry, maybe Tobias can provide more insight there. There's also the mathematics of to what extent do I get my hands on one of these pool bottles, which is for us not the case, because we are essentially offering our model as a service. So we don't have to consider it as a cost element as such.
Right. I mean, mineral water bottles have been around for a long time, and I'm guessing most German consumers would be used to the, I have to remember now, was it 10 or 15 cents, Tobias, that you...
It's 15 cents. And actually there's one important logic behind this deposit. And that is, the deposit should always be a little lower than the initial price of the bottle, especially for big pool systems. And it's very easy to understand, because if the deposit would be higher and the price for the bottle would be lower, you have no incentive to reuse the bottle.
Right.
And so it's a very simple logic for pool management. You have the price of or the deposit should always be a little lower than the initial price of the container, and then you're better off, and you keep the container circulating. Of course, if you look at the market right now, what's happening out there with raising energy prices and so on, for example, glass bottles became a lot more expensive. So especially the beer guys in Germany, they're complaining that the deposit is now too low.
Yeah.
It's only 8 cents. There is also, I can understand that, but this is the problem. Once you have a system out there with billions of bottles, it's almost impossible to change the deposit, because what would happen if we announce that we are going to raise the deposit? Everybody would keep the bottles at home and wait until the higher deposit is around, and there's almost no way with a standardized bottle to mark them in some way. So it's really a difficult thing, because once you set the deposit, you actually can only change it with a new container. Then,
Right.
Of course, you could do it, but and then one more thing, and which is really something I'm thinking of for a long, long time. How can we adjust deposits on cross-border? It's exactly what you say. I had actually, I think, even exact the same bottle you were just showing last weekend when I was in the Netherlands. I had 10 cents. Yep. And you could take, we have almost the same bottle. Yet now imagine we would have exactly the same bottle. I wouldn't like to take, or if I bring it from Germany, I would like to return it in the Netherlands and the other way around. But in this case, we would to harmonize the deposits. And I think we need it. We have to do it. But it's a very, very difficult task. And considering all the problems associated to a change of the deposit, it's a big task.
Very interesting learning, particularly also looking at other countries and sharing your jars, your bottles in other countries. Are there any limitations, I don't know, from a taxation point of view, or indeed the height of a deposit? I hadn't even thought about that one so far. And I was kind of wondering, talking about the height of deposit, for example, we've seen the Fabo box, so the PP container, where the majority of people said, well, €2.5, maybe €5 I'm willing to pay. Perhaps, Anika, you know the actual amount that this company is charging as a deposit?
It is actually €5.
It is 5.
Both for the small containers, but also for different sizes of containers. Yeah.
I'm kind of assuming that is not the cost price, although, maybe in the beginning, if you have small volumes, it might be. Yeah, valuable lesson in this case being, changing a deposit height is a very tricky thing, particularly for huge pooling systems. I can imagine that. And I had a talk with a large beer brewer that was exactly struggling with the same. So that could then also be a bit of a warning. If you choose a deposit, it's going to be tricky moving forward, changing it, right? But would there be, this being an open question for all of you, would the new development of, let's say, internet-based systems, so through an app, etc., would that offer new possibilities for playing with the height of a deposit, for example? Just wondering.
I'm not sure about playing with the height of the deposit, but definitely it offers new ways of providing reusable packaging containers that might be more expensive at first, to actually also incentivize return without creating a barrier through the deposit. I mean, there is a different barrier if you look into those app-based reusable packaging systems like Relevo or Vital. There was no barrier in terms of the deposit, because you just provide your contact details through the app. You can borrow the container for free, and you have to return it within 14 days, typically, to a restaurant or another partner. But there is another barrier, which is that you need a smartphone in order to actually use the reusable packaging container. There were some new developments of using some kind of a card, where you pay once for this card, and then with this card you can also borrow your reusable packaging container. It has some pros and cons. So I think it has the pro that also more expensive containers can be more easy in circulation. On the other side, it's not as inclusive as a deposit-based system for the entire society. Those that are not familiar or don't want to use an app or a smartphone.
And it raises new problems. I mean, think about privacy. I think there is a lot of positive things to mention about those new systems, but to me, they raise new issues. I'm really not willing to share my personal data on how often I'm eating, let's say, fritters and other stuff, and they can follow up exactly because they can see when, what, where did I buy it, and that's part of actually the business model also of these companies. So the smart thing is, if you have a deposit, it's anonymous, it's easy accessible, and it's low tech basically. So it's really a question of balancing that. There are lots of pros and cons. It's especially with high value containers that have a high price, you need a higher deposit, and there the entrance barrier to buy it or to would be more difficult, and this is the logic of Vital, for example, but it raises new issues.
Yeah, I certainly can imagine. And then this is another one of those examples where we will be looking towards developments in Germany that will come as of January 1st, right? When these to-go containers will be obligatory to also offer as a to-go place. So we get quite some questions from companies like, okay, so what will happen? What is a logical height for a deposit? Who will clean it? Are there service providers that does the cleaning for us? I think one of the questions in the chat actually was around the MMP jars. If you as a startup join it, who will actually clean those containers if you don't have a cleaning system yourself? Is that managed through, I don't know, the majority of players having washing capacities, or do you hire external services to clean them?
Shall I answer on that, Anika, or would you?
Go ahead, and yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I think this was Teresa's question, and actually that I said it's in writing, it would be too complicated to write it all down, because it's part of the issue we are currently handling. Because the established big companies, they had a completely line in place, which is washing and refilling it. And the small startups, for them, we are actually currently having some projects on establishing facilities to wash, which because it's a matter of efficiency for smaller companies to let this be done by others. I think, André, you are also working in your business model with providing washed, cleaned containers. So it makes a lot of sense, but it has to build up new infrastructures, which is part of the project we are currently running here. André?
Exactly like you said, and this is, like I said earlier, the beauty of our reuse association, because multiple startups are looking to build pool systems for different categories, and this is exactly where there will be synergies. We need to see how the future cleaning facilities can cope with that, but we're talking to each other, and we're looking to find the right way to clean, the right places to clean, the right reverse logistic infrastructures to pool knowledge and handle those challenges together.
And if I may just ask a question also from the chat towards André. Now you switched off your camera, it seems. I hope you're still there.
I was frozen.
Talking about transport and cleaning, there has been a question about, well, if on the other side, single-use items might be 100% recyclable and actually being 100% recycled at the end of their life, is reusable packaging actually still better than single-use packaging? And how do you deal? How you as a startup and provider of a reusable packaging system, how do you deal? Probably you encounter those questions quite regularly, that you have to justify if reusable packaging is actually more sustainable, or at least as sustainable as single-use packaging.
That's a very theoretical question. If it was possible to really close 100% the industrial loop of a certain type of plastic, for example, and make sure you can reuse it over and over and over and over again, it becomes a very valid question. From our current status quo, we are very, 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 very far away from this. The best case we can talk about as a comparison is 50% of contents in recycled packaging coming from household clothes sources, as well as 50% from the source that is the single-use deposit source for plastic bottles. And combining those two, you can create something, but they are very limited quantities. I think it's a very easy mathematical approach that you can take when you look at it from a sustainable perspective on the resource use side. Just in Germany, for example, consumers in Germany use 10 bottles single-use plastic for shampoo per year. That's 83 million bottles. Just for shampoo, 83 million bottles. Over 10 years, that's 8 billion single-use bottles that are used. We could serve the same need with 166 million reuse bottles. So 8.3 billion versus 166 million bottles. Now, again, if these 8.3 were all recycled in a closed loop, you would really need to look at other drivers like energy used to clean versus energy used to break down and build up again. But as of today, that's a very easy answer. Reusing is a lot more sustainable than single using and destroying, as long as we focus to optimize regional setups, meaning a reuse system that ships bottles back to China for cleaning and then filling and sending back. Very likely from a CO2 emission point is not going to balance. But generally speaking, if we are in regional setups, and that ideally, what Tobias said earlier, scale into other regions and can build into other regions, then it will be the most sustainable solution. And we've got numbers on this, but it totally will explode everything if we start digging into this today. Maybe in another session, we'll be happy to share. And we're working on this in the Reuse Association as well, how to model this moving forward for anyone.
Yeah, very valid point, André. Transport distance will become a very, very quickly heavy factor in making these calculations. Does it make sense to move to reusable and wash them on the other side of the country? Not necessarily relevant for the Netherlands, being quite small, but you already see in Germany, as I think you, Tobias, showed, right? You need to have local hubs for cleaning instead of dragging it hundreds of kilometers up and down. Mm-hmm. And, taking this consideration into mind, and at the same time, following the vision that we need to facilitate in Europe cross-border systems for reuse, I would like to ask both the panelists for some few questions that we do not manage to answer now in the chat, whether they might be able to answer there for a bit, and or for those that ask the question to contact the speakers. And at the same time, for our last call for collaboration that we have from a player that is exactly looking to do that, to start a service reusable packaging that will also be able to expand into the Netherlands, for example. And just checking whether Christian is managing to open his microphone and camera. Being you will have almost the final word. I will take a last minute towards the end, but I will give the floor to you for 2-3 minutes to share your system and particularly your call for collaboration to the Dutch audience, and then tell the rest.
Perfect. Thank you, Marcel. And 3 minutes, here we go. I'm Christian. I'm with Circujar, and Circujar is, with your help, going to be the pool system for soups, spreads, antipasties, sauces, and so on within Europe. But as I said, 3 minutes, let's go. I have to click here, sorry. One, too much. Our mission is to deploy a clean, climate-neutral packaging all over Europe. Therefore, we are building a deposit system based on reusable deposit jars. We call them the circular jars. The circular jars are designed to be really used in a deposit system. They are easy to clean, customizable. They are available in multiple sizes. And we want the fillers to able to use very easy pay-per-use system, and not only the fillers, but everybody who is along the supply chain. Our approach that tackles something that Tobias already said before, extends existing processes. So we talked in the last 2 years to fillers, to cleaners, to wholesalers, to food retail markets to optimize everything. And so we have like 5 steps here. We deliver the circuit jars within circuit trays, which are used to carry those jars. They are then filled, so they're delivered to the fillers fill them. Then using the wholesalers infrastructure, it's sent to the food retail markets where they are sold then, and selling the empty jars are reversed or returned using the reverse vending machines in the food retail marketing. From the wholesalers, we pick them up, the jars, we clean them, we inspect them if they are still ready to go, and we hope that 30 to 50 times they can go this loop before we have to recycle them. So 2 minutes. We are using deposit, but we will skip that because we've already talked about that, and it's actually easy to read. What is important for you to know, except for, or in contrast to the others, we're not yet on the market. But we developed the circuit jars and circuit trays for European usage already in 2021. In 2022, we started with the preparation for tests with fillers, wholesalers, and food retail markets. And we are here right now. We are doing the final tests. The rollout in Germany will start in a few weeks. We start the preparation for internationalization soon, and the internationalization will start in 2023. And this is where we come to you guys. If you're interested in starting something really cool, and if you are interested in joining the revolution, just contact us. 3 minutes done. Go to the website, circular.com, and write us an email.
Yeah, thank you so much. You managed your hero. We had an even fuller program, imagine. So we managed to, I think, share a lot of interesting insights, and judging the questions in the chat, certainly not enough time to answer all of them. So thank you, Christian. Obviously, also thank you all other speakers. Big applause for Anika for arranging the program, and I will not hold you responsible for COVID. So those 2 speakers, we might perhaps even be able to organize a follow-up session to take their learnings.
Thank you for me make this quick call.
You're welcome. Thanks for making this open collaboration. Hope to see your startup company also in the Netherlands at some point soon. Same obviously for CME and Zero and many of the companies that we are only slowly building here in the Netherlands. Perhaps we can learn from each other and speed things up. So with that, asking Marge and or Jorik to show the final slide for those that want to understand more about the community of practice on reusable packaging. Apologies. Do reach out. We have a quick question for those of you who are have some interesting feedback for us to make this webinar even better. Please do click the link in the chat. This webinar was recorded. You will be able to see it at KIDV's YouTube channel, and all of those that have registered via a link on our website, you will receive a mailing with the report of the webinar with presentations that you can download from there. So with all the wealth of information that has been shared, it will be easy to put it on pause when you watch the recording, or just download the presentation yourself. Do reach out if you have any questions to us. Anika's email address was at the beginning. Perhaps you can drop it here in the chat as well for a second, Anika. Thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you, Tobias and André. And nonetheless, all the best and the best health to Sasha and Martina. Hope that your COVID will cure soon. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, audience. It was great to have you. Bye-bye.
And thank you also from my side for co-organizing, and happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you from my
Have a
side.
nice day, everybody.
Invitation.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Tobias. Tschüss. Bye-bye.